¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a un nuevo directo dentro de los cursos de verano de la Universidad de las Hespérides. Ya hemos tenido otros directos dentro de este marco, una entrevista a Martin Krause y también una mesa redonda con alumnos que participaron en la universidad. Y hoy vamos a terminar, porque también la universidad, los cursos de verano terminan hoy, con una entrevista a probablemente el profesor estrella invitado este año a la universidad, el profesor de Economía de la Universidad, George Mason, a quien ya tuvimos ocasión de entrevistar en este canal a propósito de los problemas de la vivienda, pero hoy queríamos hacer una entrevista más extensa sobre su pensamiento, su obra y sus propuestas. Me estoy refiriendo al economista Bryan Caplan. ¿Qué tal, Bryan?
Muy bien.
La entrevista la vamos a hacer en inglés para facilitar la interacción y también que Bryan pueda expresarse con toda la profusión que desee. Hello, Bryan. Welcome to the channel.
Fantastic to be here, Juan.
Well, I want to start this interview asking you about your ideas. What are your core ideas in economics and in political philosophy? How would you define yourself?
I would say in economics, I think of myself as a behavioral economist, someone who tries to combine psychology with economics to get a better understanding of what's going on. I know that behavioral economics, people think of it as left-wing or interventionist and say, look, in practice, yes, but the idea of understanding how human beings think and feel, it's not a political idea. It is just a deep insight, and it's one where it is required for progress. Of course, I'm also a free market economist, someone who thinks that markets are really underrated and government is really overrated. Right now, I'm working on a new book called Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets, where I really try to directly address why do I think that free markets are so much better than most people believe, including most economists? Why is government so much worse than most people believe, including most economists? And then in terms of political philosophy or philosophy in general, I would say I put myself in the tradition of the Scottish philosophers of common sense. Philosopher Michael Huemer of the University of Colorado is the best modern exponent of this. The main idea there is that all good philosophical arguments start with premises that would make sense to a normal person that does not already agree with your conclusion. If you need to say, here's how I prove my philosophy with some extremely controversial premises, like here's how the basis of my philosophy is you should never aggress against another human being no matter what. It's like, yeah, it's basically one that would only convince people who totally agree with you. And it's also not a good way to get to truth. Like, well, why that principle? So it's much better to start with very mundane, bland, simple principles and that are not overstated, not like always, ever, but rather when like normally it is wrong to go and murder another person and then see how far can we get from there. I think a lot of what Mike Huemer shows and the way this approach to philosophy shows is you can actually get very far by starting with premises that are widely accepted, would not be one that only your best friends in the world would agree with, and you can still get to some quite surprising conclusions. So that is where I see myself philosophically.
But politically, would you describe yourself as a minarchist, an anarchist?
Right. My answer to that is definitely anarcho-capitalist, but not the crazy kind. Right?
And what do you mean by not the crazy kind?
The crazy kind are the ones who think if you press a button, everything's going to be great today. That's just not true. That's
Rothbard red button.
Yes. That's not true. But rather, as I explain in my recent debate on anarchism with Yaron Brook, what I say is that once people expect there to be the free market provision of even the most basic government services, once it's accepted that this is the normal way, then I say it will be stable. I'd say that anarchism would not work today in the same sense that democracy would not have worked in 10th century Sweden. It's not that the idea is unworkable. It's that if people are totally unfamiliar with the idea, then it's not going to be something that will actually be stable, even if you could get it, which would also be crazy. In that debate, I actually do this thought experiment. Imagine you go to 10th century Vikings in Sweden and explain democracy, and like they would all laugh at you. They'd say like, fought full stop, the strongest of men from just a killing, the guy who won your stupid election. And it's like, So yeah, in a world where people think that way, it wouldn't be stable. But in modern Sweden, on the other hand, if a losing political party said, why don't we just to kill our enemies, people would then laugh at that. And what the difference is that in general, with government, with all sorts of social organizations, a very big determinant of whether it will be stable is just whether people believe it will be stable. There are some systems that are so bad that even if people believe in it, it doesn't work. Right? So like socialism, like people can believe it will work, it still doesn't work. But there are a lot of other ones where as long as people accept this is how it's going to be, then that's enough for it to be stable. And that's what I say about anarcho-capitalism. And again, the crazy ones are those who say it'll work right here, right now. And like, no, like it will not work right here, right now. If you abolish the government right now, it would just be a civil war and there'd be something worse that would happen.
So to restate in economic terms, you are saying that we don't only need formal institutions, perfectly defined formal institutions, but informal institutions, the culture.
Right. You're right. We just say, so expectations.
And expectations. You could include them in informal expectations.
I mean, I like the word expectations more than just culture because culture is very vague. It could mean a lot of things. It's like, do we need to have the Judeo-Christian culture to get this? Like, no, I don't think so. Like you could have lots of different religious backgrounds. It just matters that people have a much more, like, this is the way things work. This is what's normal. And then I think that the very radical libertarian dream is actually a practical possibility. But first you got to get people to understand what's going to happen and how it would work.
And how do you think could we move from here to a more free society? Because obviously only reforms does not necessarily lead us to a more free society if we don't have those expectations towards the working of a free society. So how we should try to advance into a free market economy?
Yeah, it's easy to make things a little better. Right, that's
in the margin.
Like at the margin, like things improve all the time. So you have like a less anti-market party gets in power, or you just get the right person in charge of the right bureau who doesn't really believe in it. In the United States, I think in the late 70s, there was an economist named Albert Kahn. Albert Kahn got appointed to run the Civil Aeronautics Board, which was airline regulation, and he happened to believe in airline deregulation, and so it happened. It wasn't even really that a lot of other people did, but if the right person gets in charge, that matters. Of course, just education matters. Podcasts matter. You matter, Juan. You are spreading these ideas to a very large number of people in the Spanish-speaking world. I will say, like, I've become amazed at how libertarian the Spanish-speaking world has been getting. Before Milei, with Milei, it's like, wow.
Yeah, well, Milei is clearly the most clear expression of that movement.
Probably the only about anarcho-capitalist in history to ever actually be the president or leader of a country. Of course, we can also see you can do that, and you still don't automatically get big changes. Basically, you've got the long run one of education, changing people's minds, talking to people, and just improving the reputation and the social acceptance of libertarians. Like honestly, a lot of people's willingness to listen is just personality. So you have a great personalidad, right? So you're wonderful, charismatic, con carisma.
Well, not so much,
right? And like you can tell like with your numbers, like so you get people's attention, and a lot of it is with humor, with just like being someone that someone would want to go and eat tapas with, right? So that's a big part of it. And I think a lot of the problem libertarians have is just a bad attitude. Right?
Yeah, in many cases, yes, for sure.
There's an old saying in English that says, no one cares what you know until they know that you care. Just making friends with people is very important. That's why whenever I get requests for publicity from mainstream media, I know there's a lot of libertarians say, oh, those horrible statist jerks. Like, look, they emailed me. They want to talk to me. I should at least give them a chance and try to be very friendly with them and say to really actually talk to them. Don't assume that the person who wants to talk to you is hostile. Like, right, maybe they are, but what good does it do to assume they're hostile? And then yes, that often will translate into both eventually changing what parties win, but also the people that wind up actually holding the chance to make government policy better or worse. I mean, like in the United States, there really are so few conservative PhDs that often Republicans wind up hiring libertarian PhDs just because, like, well, who else do we get?
Even Trump had to do it initially.
Yeah, like Trump hired a lot of libertarians, usually for lower profile things, but where they made a lot of difference. So if I remember the numbers correctly, regulation really did grow at a slower rate under Trump than it did under any measured U.S. president, including Reagan. And that's not because Trump is actually very anti-regulation, but like he's got to give the job to somebody, and there's just a scarcity of people to do those jobs that will work for someone like Trump.
You have said that one way of pushing for free markets is to changes in education. But not only changes in education. One of your books is Selfish Reasons for Having More Kids.
Yes, selfish reasons to have more kids.
To have more kids, correct. What's your perspective on this? Make us a summary, because you think that libertarians could grow if they start reproducing themselves and having children, but also it's important to provide children with, well, not exactly, I think, your point, or it's a mixture, but it's also important to providing them with good education, although you think that children will grow up as they are designed to grow up.
Right. Let's see. So do you want me to tell you the general idea of the book, or focus on this exact question?
General idea and focus on this.
All right. So the general idea of the book is this. There's a lot of books that tell people to have more kids, but almost all of my competition just says, sure, having kids is a terrible, horrible burden. You have to give up all the fun in your life, but do it anyway for the greater good. It's like, all right, it doesn't seem like a very persuasive argument to me, and I don't notice many people actually listening to that. I wanted to go and give a very different argument based upon the actual evidence that we have on nature versus nurture. So let's back up. People have been arguing for thousands of years about why children resemble their parents in so many ways. Right? For things like physical resemblance, almost everyone realizes, right, it's just heredity. Your dad has a big nose, you have a big nose. It wasn't like he's sitting there saying, now, son, make sure you grow a big nose when you're an adult. There are many things where everybody realizes, okay, that's just caused by heredity. But then there's a lot of other things, especially for psychological traits, for intellectual traits, for social traits, where people are very strongly think, no, that's just due to your parents telling you, okay, be smart, read books. All right. Anyway, this debate went on for thousands of years, and they made no progress because it's just people making stuff up. And then about 70 years ago, many researchers said, well, look, the problem is that we're normally studying families where they've got half their genes and they're raised together. So studying ordinary families, these two different forces, logically distinct, nature versus nurture, are tied together. We can't really figure it out using the regular data. But is there special data? And they realize there is. So we have kids that are adopted. So there they share only the upbringing, but not the heredity. And on the other hand, we have the opposite. We have most obviously separated twins, identical twins separated at birth. That doesn't happen very often. But we also have two kinds of twins. We have identical twins which share all their genes, fraternal twins that share half their genes, and they can all be raised in the same home. You can say, well, are the identical twins more similar than fraternal twins? Because like you're all growing up in the same family, but one set of twins has an extra 50 percentage points of genetic similarity. This is a method that has been used over the last 70 years to actually get real answers to these questions of nature versus nurture. And the main answer is that nature is much more important than nurture, especially in the long run, least in first world conditions. Right? So those are all important qualifiers, but nature is much more important, especially in the long run, at least in first world countries. Now, what does this have to do with the number of kids that you have? This was actually the inspiration for the book, is like, look, right now in most rich countries, there's the main popular parenting philosophy is what in the United States we call helicopter parenting, where you fly around your kid all the time. Are you doing okay? Are you doing okay? Read a book, read a book, be nice, read a book, vote Democrat. So this kind of stuff all of it based on a theory, not a fact, that you must do this stuff to give your kid a good future. What I say is that the science shows that helicopter parenting is based on error. It is not true that you have to do all this stuff. And then this is what's important, right? If you love doing all that stuff, fine, you're not doing harm. But most people, it is stressful. It is a lot of work. What I say is you can get the same kids you would get anyway while reducing the painful part of parenting a lot. And that's why the book is called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, basically saying that people are mistaken about the actual price of kids in terms of the lifestyle sacrifice. I'll still say, look, there's still some sacrifice, of course, but I say it's just a lot less. The benefit, and on the other hand, I think you can also get the benefits higher by having more fun with your kids and doing things that you enjoy instead of things that feel like suffering. So that is the whole point of the book. I think about it as the science is a coupon for kids. It's like kids 30% off, right? And if you say like, I hate kids, right, fine, throw the coupon away. But for all the people who like the idea of kids, but just feel like the cost is too high, this first of all says you can have a better time. But second of all, 30% off. Maybe I will have another kid. Right now, I have like this book is written for a general audience. There's no direct libertarian connection, but like you're saying, I am especially eager for libertarians to know the facts and to appreciate the arguments because first of all, yes, through genetics alone, right? One of the things where we have good evidence that genetics matter is political views, right? And people say, like, how could genetics affect politics? Like, we've got good data showing they do. If you're really confused, and look, a lot of political views are related to personality, right? So there are people who have a calm, fact-based, reality-based view of the world, and that tends to lead you to some certain political views, such as free markets.
That's somewhat connected, sorry, with Jonathan Haidt, because there might be some connection.
Sure. There could definitely be a Haidt connection, right? And of course, there's other people where their personality, like they're dreamers, like, let's just go and share everything, right? And these personalities lead to different political views. And here is the little result of my book. Like if libertarian men would just donate heavily to sperm banks, that would increase the libertarian share of the population purely through hereditary methods. Maybe don't tell the people that your goal, because probably the libertarian sperm wouldn't be that popular. But fact remains.
Who knows?
Now that aside, of course, also means that just by having more kids the normal way, you are increasing the number of statistical libertarians. Like the data, they does not say that every child born to libertarian is libertarian. No. It's not that strong. Just like not everyone born to shy parents is shy, but there is a strong genetic effect. And so it is totally possible. And in fact, you should expect that if you have more kids, that even if you don't do much work, they will actually tend to be libertarian if you're a libertarian, and this is raising the libertarian share. Now, we would have to do a lot of this to win, right? But it is a great long-run strategy. So let's see. There's a group in America called the Amish. Have you heard of them?
Sure.
Yeah. So sometimes people don't know about strange American religious groups. So I think right now they're at like 200,000 or 300,000 people. Like 100 years ago, they were like 2,000. So they multiply their numbers 100-fold in like a century, right? Say these numbers are from memory, so they're rough ballpark. And it really does mean that if like just by having a high birth rate for even like 5 generations, you really can actually greatly multiply your numbers. So it's not a way to get liberty in our lifetimes, but it's a way to get liberty in 200 years if we would just become a highly fertile people. Then that's true. Now, one last point on this. There is a good question. So like, why is it that upbringing doesn't matter very much? Right now, and this is just fact. This is what we see in the data. One story is that people are just immune to parental pressure. That's possible. Another story is that parents don't apply nearly enough, right? If they just did a lot more. All right. Now, this is one where we have some interesting evidence from the real world that sheds light on this. Like, so for example, it's typical in the United States for students to do 3 years of Spanish in school. Virtually zero Americans actually learn Spanish from those 3 years. And yet, is it possible for an American to learn Spanish, especially if they start as a teenager? Yeah, it's totally possible. So what's the difference between people that learn it and people who don't? Some of it's intelligence and so on. A lot of it, though, is the amount of effort. The amount of effort people are putting in American high schools is hardly anything, and so they don't get much. If they did 10% more, it wouldn't be anywhere near enough. But like if you really wanted your kid to speak Spanish, if you did 10 times what the normal amount, that's what it takes to work. Now, for libertarians, what I would say is, right, so if you really want your kids to be libertarians, sure, you've got a good basis in genetics, but also don't just be something that you mention 3 times in 20 years. Right? So like, I know a lot of economists whose kids don't know economics. They're smart enough, but it's like, well, why is it important? Like, what do you mean it's not important? Every 5-year-old should understand supply and demand. And yes, that is how I've raised my kids. My kids understand supply and demand from a young age, and they hear it over and over and over. So let's say, like, if the dosage is high enough, like at a level that most people wouldn't want to do, but this is something else libertarians can do, is you can't say do a high dosage for everything. Like there aren't enough resources, but very high dosage for the top priorities, the things that matter the most to you. So appreciating liberty, understanding economics, that's what these are some of the things that really matter to me. And these are things where I'm confident I have actually, genetics aside, increased my kids, just because I don't just tell them once or twice. I tell them 1,000 times.
Your children understand very well economics and also speak Spanish better than most Spaniards.
Yes, so I don't speak Spanish, but yeah, I know how people learn languages because I was not taught the correct way. So yeah, when my sons were learning a language, I had them do it the right way. And so you've talked to them, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yes. Míos hablan bien español como castellanos, pero yo no.
Well, you also speak more or less Spanish, but your children, I think, would appear Spanish for most standards. How does this connect with your other book, The Case Against Education? Because in some sense, you are saying that if you want people to deeply understand some issue, even if they have some genetic predisposition to it, you have to put a lot of effort in teaching and speaking and interiorizing them. But at the same time, you say universities are mostly useless because they are just a signaling way of providing what in Spanish we call titulitis. This is the hunger for a title.
Las estampas, las estampas.
So how
necesitamos muchas estampas
to differentiate from the others, and to communicate to others. What's your view on university? Do you think they should be much restricted? They should be reformed to be more useful? What do you think?
Right. So the subtitle of The Case Against Education is Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money. So it's focusing on the actually existing education systems that we know and do not like. Right. I don't like them. Anyway, you don't. So what can we say about that? So one of the main things, the main policy prescription that I push in the book is austerity. Austeridad, like large cuts in education spending. In fact, I'd be amazed if we could cut education spending by $1, by €1. That would be amazing because people are so resistant to it. The main argument I give, so after saying the existing system's terrible, is then, so why not improve it rather than try to go and just cut the money? And my answer there is cutting money is easy. Anyone can do it. Improving it is really hard. Right? And we can just see in how long the system has been terrible that improving it, like either we don't know, or the system is just very resistant to reasonable methods. My view actually there is it's the second thing. The system is corrupt, it's broken, they will not listen to reasonable ideas. Again, going back to foreign language education in America, there is very good science on how you really teach foreign languages. Inmersión, right? So like in college, I had German classes and those were taught very well. On the first day of the first class of German 1, the teacher says, "Man kann hier kein English sprechen." And like that means like, you cannot speak any English here. And it's like, well, how do I? Nein! Like, and that's where you sit there like, okay, I need to learn a few words just to be able to do it. That is what works. That will actually do it. American K-12 education does the opposite of that. They have some exercises, they sing a few songs, there's no standards, and they just waste years not teaching it. Now, the question is, why does the system persist in teaching foreign languages in this terrible way? I think the answer is that they don't actually want to succeed. They don't value the acquisition of knowledge. They just want to go and have an activity to do together. And also, like, they don't want to have to be the bad guy. The teachers don't want to have to be like man kann hier kein Englisch sprechen. They don't want to have to do that. They just want to, let's all sing a song together in Espanol. Okay, so that's what they want to do. And what I often say is, so if you go and meet teachers in America, I'm guessing Spain is the same, but say, look, they're generally very nice, but they're not logical, they're not rational, they're not disciplined, they don't care about getting results, except for like some math teachers, some science teachers. They're the good ones usually, right? And say that's the problem, is that we have a system where they do not actually care about acquiring knowledge of any kind, useful or useless. Actually, it's just about having an activity to do together to fill the time. If you went and put me in charge of the curriculum, I do think I know a lot of ways to improve it. But a lot of it starts with, okay, maybe we could go and teach Americans foreign languages if we did 10 times the effort, but is it worth it? Is that actually a sensible way to spend the time of American students in a world where English is so widely spoken? And I would say, no, it is not. So instead, I say that a well-structured curriculum would focus on teaching people things that they actually will be useful for them to know in real life. Of course, some of these things schools already try to do, but poorly, like teaching reading, writing, mathematics. But American education has very poor performance. So about a third of American adults are at least close to illiterate. They know letters, but they can barely read. They have trouble doing even basic math. A lot of the problem is, maybe that person shouldn't have spent 3 years in Spanish. Maybe that person should have done 3 more years of practicing basic reading, writing, and math. So yes, first of all, before wasting time on luxuries, make sure people actually get very basic skills, which are vital in adult life. But then after that, it's like, well, once people know that, let's go and teach them things that they actually plausibly would use in the real world. Right? So that's another way that I would change the system. And then finally, there's a small share of people that actually love learning and ideas. People are curious. If you're listening to us out there, tiene curiosidad. All right, so you have a lot of curiosity. That's why you're listening. So for people like that, then something more like a much improved version of traditional college makes sense. It does not make sense for most people who have such low curiosity. And again, some of it is, well, if they had better teachers, but the reality is that even the best teachers are just incapable of inspiring love of ideas in most people. Steven Pinker, famous Harvard professor. He's gotten many awards for being the most fascinating, fantastic lecturer. And yet, he writes that about half of his students don't even show up. He's a fascinating mind, but he's not fascinating to half of his actual students, at least. So I think we just need to be honest and say, this stuff is just not very interesting to the vast majority of people. And rather, we should have a special system for the small minority of people that actually love ideas. And for everyone else, stop wasting everyone's time, stop pretending, and prepare them for real life.
And what about the university system? Because in the American universities are top world universities. Supposedly. What's your perspective on that?
Right. I'd say anyone who believes this should just go and sit in some random classes in the United States. The teaching is very poor. Teaching is very poor. A lot of it is because the students don't care, and it's hard to teach students that don't care. But also on top of that, even outside of humanities and social sciences, most of it is just what we call going through the motions. You just go and you go through your notes. But in math and science, most people, they would never learn from the coursework. They have to actually sit down with the book and do the problems. So there's that. But then when you get to humanities and social sciences, this is where I say they are so politically corrupted, so dogmatic, so fanatical. This wokeness really is a religion. People in America often say, yes, well, humanities and social sciences in America, it's basically like the American version of the madrasa, where you get theology. You get, these are the sacred books. So not so much Marx, which is actually would be better than what they're teaching. Marx at least there's some effort
internal
to go,
consistency.
and there's like, it's a bad arguments, but there's like some arguments they connect together.
Yeah.
It isn't just the garbage that people are getting of woke brainwashing. So now the area where American universities they do perform well is on research, which of course you can be a great researcher and actually be a bad teacher. And I'd say the correlation is probably positive, but quite low. And again, like, so isn't it great we have all this research? Like the research in STEM, there probably it actually does have at least a good amount of value. Although even there, I tend to think, would it be better if a lot of the pure mathematicians were working in industry instead? Yeah, I think a lot of what's going on in even STEM is something that is basically a game, a hobby for people, and it drains off a lot of the best minds. Now, when you go over to humanities and social sciences, I'll say most of it is just terrible. It is just theology. And you're like, is it all? No. So like, economics is, of course, better. Still, actually, has been getting quite a bit worse in recent years. But yes, so economics is better. Even there, though, like most of what gets published in economics, I think if you really were honest about it, you would say, like, this is not a very important question and it will have no actual effects on the real world. There's always this official idea that, oh, I go and I research these small policy questions. They might seem small but government's going to listen to me and then it'll lead to billions of dollars of value. Just one small change could, all right, there's just this one problem. The people doing the research generally make zero effort to actually publicize the work or see if anybody knows it. They just publish in a journal and they forget it. So then what good does it actually do? A lot of what I do in my books is I try to actually find lots of small pieces of research where the author didn't do anything with it, didn't promote it. And I try to put it together in a package and then say, once you see the big picture of education, then it becomes useful policy. Then we see that we need austeridad. Then you see that we need vocational education. What is that?
Educación vocacional.
Yes. So then we see that. But if you only read the 1,000 individual papers, you wouldn't get this picture. And I try to go and take work that would have never done any good and then put it between two covers so it can actually do some good. Of course, even when you try, usually people don't listen to you and you fail. I had a friend who was saying, well, if you don't think government will actually do what you say, why bother? And like, if I can just increase the self-confidence of people who are skeptical of spending more on education by a little bit, just to know, look, there are some people that have serious arguments saying that education spending is not such a great idea. If I can just get a few more votes in Congress saying, look, we're not going to go and give more money to this stuff, I will think that my work actually did yield a lot of value, although much less than if people actually listen to me, where I think we've got trillions of dollars of savings just sitting there.
Coming from the US, I have to ask you about another issue. I think you have not written any book on it, but certainly you have written many pieces of articles, which is the healthcare system. You are saying that in education, we need austerity. We need many cuts in educational spending. What's your perspective on healthcare? Because the US is spending more than any other country in the world, and results are not clearly superior in many cases. So is there a problem with the US health system? How should we fix it? Is better, for instance, the public healthcare that we have in European countries? I think you love the Singapore system of healthcare, although in the last 10 years, it has also go through some reforms. What's your perspective on this?
Right. So the first thing, so let me talk directly to the camera here so everybody hears. The most important thing for Europeans to understand about US healthcare is we have an enormous amount of government spending. Right? US government spends over $1 trillion on healthcare every year. It is not true that we have a free market system. It is not remotely close to true. Rather, we have a system where we spend a crazy amount of money on a minority of people. So elderly people in the United States get government-provided health care. The poor, depending upon certain conditions, get government-provided health care. So we have an especially dysfunctional one. There are many countries that get universal care for the same cost that the US gets for covering maybe 20 or 30% of the population. Right, so that's one where you say, well, maybe the European system is better than the US one. Say, that's not as crazy as it sounds once you understand the facts, although here's what I would say. if the U.S. moved to a European system, we would not we would not do it like you do. Instead, we would just go and spend a ton of money on everyone. What's wrong with the U.S. system? Like, all countries have this nonsensical idea of if it saves one life. So we should spend any amount of money to save one life, which is a crazy idea. It sounds good. It's poetry. But if you really did that, that would mean that you would have to spend all your money on one person and have nothing left for anything else. Not only not for healthcare, you wouldn't have anything left for food, for entertainment, for actually enjoying life. No human being wants to spend their own money that way. We want to go and have there are trade-offs. Like, yeah, I can be healthier, but I also want to go and eat at a restaurant occasionally. Of course, even with your own health, it's like you could keep perfect body weight, but then you'd have to give up a lot of enjoyment, and almost no one decides it's better to be perfectly healthy and enjoy no food. Instead, people do trade-offs. Anyway, so the U.S. is especially crazy about if it saves one life, where if government is paying for the healthcare, then they hate to say no for any treatment, no matter how expensive, no matter how experimental, no matter how rarely it works. So this is a big part, is that the U.S. generally has smaller government than Europe, but when we do have government, we have especially stupid government, right? You can also see this in things like the U.S. spends, I think, like 6 times as much to drill a subway tunnel as in Europe, right? So there's always government waste, but U.S. government is especially crummy. And I say, look, Americans should always assume that any time that we hand power to the U.S. government, it will continue to be the U.S. government. It won't just be a government which is bad by itself. It will be an especially incompetent, corrupt, and just mush-headed, weak-minded kind of government. My general view about healthcare, though, is yes, we totally should have austerity. We should have large cuts, and so why? A very big part of this. So this is something that I learned from my colleague Robin Hanson. I just did not believe him at first, but I've read more, which is that the actual effect of healthcare in general on human health is overrated. So lifestyle, diet, exercise, these things are much more important for health than medicine. Right? I think this is one, like, how do you know? Well, there's a lot of different kinds of evidence. Some kinds of evidence just consist in, let's compare areas that have higher or lower spending. So you can see, I think it's Costa Rica has the same life expectancy as the United States, despite spending a tiny fraction of what the U.S. spends on healthcare. You can also see, of course, within the United States, there's people who have equal access to government healthcare and yet very large differences in life expectancy. But most impressive, there are actually some experiments that have been done where people are given different levels of subsidy for their healthcare. And we can see that the more subsidies you have, the more healthcare people use. But it is very hard to see any difference in health of the people that get higher subsidies. So what I say here is that people just greatly overestimate the effect of medicine on health, which means that if someone says, look, I don't believe in government in general, but for something as absolutely important as life or death as this, we need to make an exception. And there you might say, no, I disagree. But I say, like, fine, you can be right. But this is not such a case. This is not actually life or death. And again, as to why this is going on, probably some of it is just that, it's how, like, your lifestyle is much more important for your health than getting treatments after the fact, after you've ruined your body. Right? So that's probably part of it. Another part is actually medical mistakes. Like, anytime you go to the doctor, you are risking them going and making you worse than you were before. Blogger Skull Alexander goes over some of these studies on medical mistakes where he says these numbers are overstated. Still, even fairly low estimates of number and severity of medical mistakes, it's shockingly high. Just think about going to the doctor and he didn't wash his hands after treating someone with a contagious disease, and then you are infected. Right? So that's probably another story, is there probably are treatments that do work, but they're getting balanced out by these other treatments, and it's just very hard to give only the good without the bad. So there is that. Like, in terms of going and improving healthcare, yes. So I think an actual free market system would be better. A lot of it just because we're spending so much money and getting so little value on it.
But do you think that in a free market system people would spend less? Because if healthcare is a luxury good, although maybe not with good reasons, but if it is, maybe we should, or we would be spending more the more rich we are.
Right. So what I would say is, I know there's some smart people who say that somehow have the government spending $1 trillion on healthcare reduces total spending. I just think this argument is completely crazy, right? Like there are if I gave it to you as a mathematical economics homework problem, you could go and show some very special conditions. But the general fact that when government spends a pile of money on something and gives it for free, that increases consumption, I think that is just beyond all doubt. This is true for, there are actual experiments with charging people for healthcare, and it is shocking how high the elasticity of demand is. Very small charges lead people to reduce the amount of medical care they get. If you believe that medical care was like magic and it's getting years to your life, then this is terrible. But given the actual evidence that it is not magic and the gains are actually quite modest, then it is a great idea to charge people more so that they actually wind up consuming less in the way of valuable resources. The idea that, it's very common in the US to say we have the best medical care in the world, right? And I'd say definitely the most expensive, right? I would say for very certain rare conditions that then probably US actually does give you the best care, right? I would say not for experimental treatments, which often kill you because they're experimental and they don't have a lot of practice. Human beings are bad at doing things for the first time. Human beings screw up. You have to have a lot of practice. So my dear friend Robin Hanson says, the smartest thing is to go to the most advanced centers of medicine and ask for a basic product. Right? Don't get the most advanced heart surgery. Get basic heart surgery from the best place where they really do have a lot of practice and it's something new. It's not where they're still using you as a guinea pig. So my view is then we should have great cuts in government spending, which I am almost sure would greatly reduce total medical spending. And so I think there's a lot of gains there because so much of it is not very useful. And then I think it also does get people thinking seriously about, is this actually worth doing? And also gets the supply side thinking, how can we go and make treatments more affordable? How can we go and focus on delivering more value? It is striking that there are some treatments that aren't covered by the US government or by private insurance. Americans go to places like Mexico and by all accounts get fantastic care, which is much cheaper. One of my favorite reforms for the US government is, how about you go and tell people they can get their Medicare treatments taken care of in Mexico and you give them some share of the savings, right? It's no, that'd be terrible. Do you have, what's the evidence that Mexican treatment is even worse? You don't know that. It's well, we need to be sure. Are you sure in America? You're not sure.
So you are advocating for cuts in education and in healthcare, probably also in other areas, but do you think voters will support that kind of policy, or they are biased? And this is connected to one of your other books, maybe the most famous book, I don't know, but one of the most famous you've written, The Myth of the Rational Voter. Do you think that we are biased towards more expenditure by government?
So this is really an idea I'm exploring, especially in my new book that I'm writing, Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. The main theme of the book: markets do the good things that sound bad, governments do the bad things that sound good. So let's spend lots of money on healthcare, for everyone, education. That sounds wonderful. It's something where most people they hear that poem and they love the idea, and it's very hard to talk them out of it, especially with a good argument. Right? So in the case against education, I actually barely talked about political bias in education, which I think is not the fundamental problem. I think there actually is now finally hope for cuts in spending for higher education. But not because of anything that I said in my book, just because of Hamas, because of Hamas and related things like that. So people who just love education want to go and rain money down on education, but then they say oh my God, these professors at American universities, they're terrible human beings. They're cheering Hamas. That's disgusting. I hate those people. Let's go and cut their spending. And I'm okay, so they are terrible, but even if they hated Hamas, they're still going and wasting people's time, failing to teach foreign languages. That's the fundamental point. But yes, the American higher education in just the last couple of years has not actually changed very much, but the word finally got out about the incredible, overwhelming woke bias of American universities, the administration, humanities departments, social science departments. And it's gotten to the level where now there's actually a large share of Americans who are disgusted with American universities and who might finally, for the first time, support taking $1 away from them. Like, I don't think it's going to be a lot, but it's like we're going to go and reduce your spending by 3% until you stop going and waving Hamas flags. All right, that is where we are for education. For healthcare, I think we are still nowhere near to there. People still believe that this is like magic, and it's just and it's just so evil to go and ask questions like, well, like, how much does this treatment cost, and what exactly is the gain to the patient? We're still not there yet. It would really have to be that we have a bunch of demonstrations of doctors and nurses waving Hamas flags around before people start saying, oh, like, even there, I don't think it would work, because it's like, well, they're waving Hamas flags, but I still want to go and get my cancer treated. It's like, like, how about you just stop smoking? I mean, this is one of the things, like during COVID, as we weren't as bad as Spain, but still, there's endless propaganda, wear masks 6 feet apart, no propaganda about lose weight. And is it because someone did a study and found that the elasticity of weight loss with respect to propaganda is low, or is the elasticity of staying 6 feet apart from people is high? It's like, no. It's just like, well, we'll just go and tell people the things we feel comfortable telling them. And on the other hand, the things that are very well supported, like high-risk lifestyles, greatly increase the mortality of COVID. Like, well, that's a personal choice. Like, well, why isn't it a personal choice if I hang out with my friends and I'm thin? Like, why is that not a personal choice? No, that's like, is highly arbitrary, based upon you only want to tell people the things where you feel like you can do it comfortably, and the harsh truths about what could actually be done about it is ones, well, if other people aren't saying it, I don't want to say it.
And also, how is this connected with immigration? I mean, you are a open border guy, but could immigrants import towards a country values, ideas that are against the reduction in government spending, or not? What's the evidence on this?
Right. Great question. What's the evidence? So the answer is, of course they could. What is the actual evidence? This is one where I've had many people claim that immigrants that they're socialists and they favor huge government, and everybody knows this. But like, when you actually go and read the pieces, like, all right, so where are the citations? What's the data? So I actually have gone to the data. So the General Social Survey is one of the best surveys that we have of long-run American political opinion. We know about the nativity of the respondents. So I actually went through the data myself, and here's what I said. So first of all, there are most of the differences that critics of immigration believe, where immigrants being more statist, most of that actually is true. It's true that people who are foreign-born in the U.S. are, by most measures, more statist than native-born Americans. And then people say, "Oh, so you have a minute." Like, calm down. But the magnitude is small. The magnitude is small, right? It is not that Americans are libertarians and Mexicans are Stalinists. We're talking about differences of a few percentiles. So you say, well, but like, even that's somewhat concerning. I agree, it's somewhat concerning. But then a few other things, right? First of all, we're not talking about a very minor imposition on human liberty when you say that you can't come to the United States. It is a major harm to go and say that you have to go and stay in the country where you're born, right? And remember, say, well, it's our country. Like, it's not your country. It is the country of the property owner. So of the employer, the landlord, like the stores, the merchants. These all of these people's rights are violated when you say that someone that wants to come can't come and work for them or rent from them or shop with them. This whole idea, this is our country and we can decide. Like, that's socialism. That is socialism. It's our country. We as a society decide. Like, no, that is go to why don't you go to Venezuela if you think that? Like, so I'll rather the focus should be on, first of all, of course, the rights of natives who want to trade, and then also like if someone from another country, they want to go and work for an American employer, what business does anyone else saying? And it's bad. Right? So most obvious, like someone in Haiti, they could go and move to Miami, shine shoes. It would be a life or death difference for them. And U.S. law says no. Now, in terms of this political harm, like I said, I don't just discount it. I face facts. So like when I was writing Open Borders, by the way, my editor actually said, well, you should take out some of this. It undermines your argument. I said, it's true. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here to only say things that make my argument look good. I'm here to go and give a fair summary of all the evidence and then tell people what the best way to think about it is. I'm not going to just go and suppress evidence that is difficult. I'm going to actually face it and address it. So the other thing is, besides there being only a marginal difference in opinion between natives and immigrants, on top of that, we have low voter participation for immigrants. So that's another reason why it's not as bad as it seems. And then finally, there's a lot of evidence of high assimilation. The fact that your parents came from Mussolini's Italy and maybe were fascists does not mean that their kids growing up in the United States are going to be fascists. Right? It is just not true that people's parents go and pass on these strange views from another country. And, like you say, well, what about all the heredity? Like, remember I was talking about the political effects of heredity. Like, it's important to remember this is within the context of growing up in a certain society. So like you mentioned, like, how could political views be hereditary when like monarchism was very popular 300 years ago and hardly anybody does? Is it that the monarchists had no children and the anti-monarchists did? So no, rather what's going on is that we are looking at how explaining political views within a society. Obviously, if you move someone to a radically different kind of society, then the very things that they're even discussing as possible do change. So if you were to go and if you wanted to make your kid into a monarchist, you got to go and like get a time machine, go back in time 300 years, and then maybe you could do it that way. But within modern American society, convincing your kid to be a monarchist, even if you were, would be very hard.
Difficult. But the profile of immigrants that the US is receiving is not the same that Europe is receiving.
Yes.
So in what sense can we translate your teachings towards the case of Europe?
Right. So here's what I would say. The main thing that I do in Open Borders is start off with the harsh truth that trapping someone in a foreign in the country of their birth, especially when that country is really bad, as many are, is a very severe harm to inflict on someone. Right? It's the kind of thing that at minimum you should say, oh my God, like to say that like a person born in Haiti can never leave those horrible conditions. At least look, it's something where it's like, oh gee, like this is not something that anyone should do lightly. And then secondly, to remember, there are an obvious and enormous gains from almost all immigration that just come from moving someone's labor from a place where its productivity is low to where its productivity is high. And when a Haitian moves to the United States, it is standard for their production to multiply by about a factor of 15. Right? And a lot of this is actually shared with the world. You go and you're working as a farmer. In a primitive farm, you barely grow anything. You come to the United States, get a job on a farm, you are producing a lot more food. There are enormous gains to the world just moving that labor from places where the value is low to places where the value is high. And then finally, right, so we've got this basic human rights issue, which is serious. We have this big economic gain. And then the question is, all the complaints that people have against the immigrants, so how severe are those? Are they so big that it makes sense to say, despite that it's a horrible thing to do, despite the gains, these harms are even greater? And then finally, is it true that there's no cheaper, more humane way to handle the problems? Right? And the most obvious one, the difference between the US and Europe is your welfare state is generally bigger and also just less restrictive. So US does a much better job of getting immigrants working than Europe does. But again, it's something more like, maybe like 15, 20 percentage points of labor force participation. It's not that European immigrants have 0% labor force participation. Or, even if you go and find, recent immigrants from the Middle East, North Africa, a year after they have gotten their legal work permission. Even there, that's like 25, but of course it goes up over time. So, but anyway, so it is a marginal difference, not night and day, bigger marginal difference. And then the question is, all right, so is the right conclusion to draw, don't let them come, or change the welfare state? Now, many people say, look, the welfare state's just unchangeable. It's like, the welfare state changes all the time, actually. The rules do get changed. I don't know of any country where you can immediately get full benefits as soon as you arrive in the country. The United States, if you are a tourist and you get in an accident, they will give you emergency care without proof that you can pay. So if you get your leg gets run over by a truck, they don't go and say, right? But on the other hand, if you say I'm dying of cancer, I hear this is the best treatment in the world. It's like, well, if you go back to your own country, My own country doesn't even have a single actual oncologist. Well, too bad. All right. So there are already limits.
Yeah.
And what I've been telling critics of immigration for years is, why don't you take all of your effort at getting a massive policy change in general immigration policy, which is very hard in the US, and why don't you go and focus it down like a laser on reducing eligibility of immigrants for welfare benefits? And this would be my advice for Europe too. Just focus on that. Why just join this general thing of punish everyone, including people that are going to work, including people that have done nothing wrong? Like, and it's like, well, that's unrealistic. So it's realistic to think you're going to get a total change in European immigration policy, but it's unrealistic to think that you could go and say that it takes 5 more years to be eligible for benefits. I think it's actually a lot more realistic to get that. So anyway, in the book, I go over a lot of the other complaints. I always try to go and be honest and say, look, these complaints are not completely wrong, but always stay calm, always think about numbers. It's like, is it true that foreigners have a higher probability of committing terrorism than natives? It is. It is definitely in the United States, almost certainly in Europe as well. But then say, all right, how big of a problem is terrorism actually? As a percentage of all murders, what actually is terrorism? It's a very low percentage, right? So in my book, I actually use the saying of being more likely to be struck by lightning than to be killed by a terrorist, right? And this is the kind of thing that reasonable people do. Now, if you just say, like, yeah, but people aren't actually reasonable, they're crazy. Like, yeah, I know. That's why I do what I do. I'm trying to make people less crazy, trying to get people to calm down. At minimum, I would hope that people who care about human liberty will be more receptive to this idea of not getting really passionate about politics, not just becoming a fanatic, but just saying, all right, look, okay, first of all, I'm listening to what other people say. I'm going to acknowledge the validity of their complaints as far as the facts warrant. And then I'm going to go and put in perspective and say, yes, it's true that foreigners commit a disproportionate share of terrorism, but it is a very tiny problem. And the fact that it really upsets us is not a reason to treat it as the most important thing in the world, because it is not a very important thing.
Well, in Spain, we have also other type of crime or criminality that is being committed by immigrants. And this is a rising problem, but of course there are other ways of
and is it actually rising, or it's just the media coverage is rising?
No, it's rising.
Yes, okay. Yes. It's standard in the US that you got crime statistics and you got media coverage.
No. In this case, there are types of crimes, for instance, violations that are rising, and mainly due to foreign immigrants. But again, there are many ways of
yes, and like the obvious thing is harsher punishments for people who are actually criminals, right? Not to go and punish everyone, including the vast majority of people who have never done anything. In terms of the actual numbers, here is what I've seen in the data. In the United States, immigrants have lower crime rates than natives. In Europe, they have higher crime rates than natives. And you say, well, is it because we let in worse immigrants? Like, a lot of it is just this. Americans have very high crime rates. Europeans have native-born Europeans have very low crime rates, and immigrants are in the middle.
In the middle,
right? Which is, on the one hand, you say, well, like they are worse. That's a reasonable point. But also the reason why they are so much worse than you is that your rates are very low. Right? So if you go to a country like Japan, where the natives have commit almost no crime at all, say, well, if you're saying like tourists have 10 times the murder rate of Japanese per day in the country, it's like, okay, but it's 10 times something that's almost zero. This is not a good reason to go and start trying to cut back tourism to Japan. Because like, especially when a probability is low, you want to say like, what is the absolute probability? Not just, like 1 in a trillion is 1,000 times as bad as 1 in a quadrillion. But if it's 1 in a quadrillion or 1 in a trillion, those are still so low that probably you should just calm down and say, life is too short to worry about this problem.
Okay, and one last question, Bryan.
Wow, I feel like we just got started.
No, we are more or less, it's 1 hour of interview, which I think it's a good time. But what would you say are your main contributions to economics, and what fields do you plan to research in the future? You have said one, but I want to hear more.
All right, so my first book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, that's about public choice, the economics of politics. And I see my main contribution there as saying, actually, the main problem with democracy is that due to very weak incentives, people are highly irrational in politics, much more so than in markets. In markets, normal people at least do things like, well, the price may seem lower, but the price per kilo is actually higher. And so actually I should make this other purchase. I eavesdrop on people in grocery stores and hear people who do not sound like they are math majors make very thoughtful arguments about products. On the other hand, almost everyone's political arguments, even people who agree with me, I just say, like, these arguments are terrible. They're just so unreasonable, so unfair, so emotional. So I say that you're focusing specifically on the problem of voter rationality and the fact that democracy encourages people to be as intellectually irresponsible as they ever get. And that's, I say, is the actual main problem with democracy. It's not special interests. It's not just ignorance. Oh, I didn't know. It's people who say they do know, but who have never actually studied the subject. So that's in the myth of rational voter. Selfish reasons to have more kids. That is in the field of family economics, economics of the family. And I would say they're just combining this research on twin adoption research with actual practical advice on optimal family size. That is the main contribution. And by the way, that book is the only one I've written that has actually noticeably improved the world. Because that book, there are hundreds of people who tell me they've had additional kids because of it, which if you use a standard economist value of life, like $10 million, so that book created billions of dollars of value for the world, not for me, but for billions of dollars of value for the world. So that's the book that I think has actually done the most good. Then I've got The Case Against Education. So I definitely did not invent the signaling model. That was invented before, right around the time I was born, actually. What that book does is it takes theory, the theory of signaling, which most of the people who work on it, that's for them, it's all it is. It's just a theory. It's like a fun math game to play. And I say, look, it's not just a theory. It is the true theory. It explains the facts. And I try to bring together a lot of evidence, not just from economics, but from psychology, from sociology, from the field called education, and say this is actually the best way to understand what's going on with education. And it does imply especially austeridad. Like the idea that economics says, oh, education is a good thing to spend money on, wrong. If you really think properly, then it's a reason for drastic cuts in the spending. It's so wasteful. Then my next book is Open Borders. So this is the one where I try to take a lot of different arguments and evidence relevant to immigration to make the case for radical deregulation, not just double high-skilled immigration, but really let almost anyone take a job almost anywhere. I try to never be totally absolutist, but just because you're not absolutist doesn't mean that you can't say almost always. Right? It's like, is it always wrong to go and kill another person? Almost always. There are certain very special cases where it's different. But if you were to say, well, like, it's just dogmatic to be against killing people, like, that's not dogmatic. That is a very good, almost always true principle. And if you think the principle is violated, be very cautious.
Juan de Marina had to say something about that with tyrannicide.
Right. And then you said my most recent book is Build Baby Build, which is similar to Open Borders. This is my book favoring radical housing deregulation. We already talked about this in a mix of English and Spanish before. So this is also one of the most destructive things that government is doing. We have the technology to make very large buildings, tall buildings, cheaply, so that almost everyone can have a beautiful, cheap place in a great location, right? And yet government is not allowing us to use this technology. And so people are suffering with some combination of very high prices, small living space, undesirable locations. Like, we've got the technology to make it abundant, right? Right now, when you go to the supermarket, you probably don't think, oh, gee, there's all this nice stuff. Too bad I can't afford it. It's like no, like the problem is I eat too much. So like it's just this incredible abundance. There's great fruit, great vegetables, great bread, great pasta, great meat, it's so wonderful. That's what markets give us in the field of food, because the regulation's real low. We could have something like that in housing, and it's just government that stopped us. In terms of what I'm working on now, so I got a few projects. Actually, a lot of the way I work is if I get an idea, so I have a queue. A list of projects, and also a list of blog posts. And really, anytime I get an idea, I say, okay, stop what I'm doing, and I go and I add it to the queue. And that means I just have more ideas than I would ever be able to write. But that's a problem everyone should have, right? Like, so I never actually say I have no idea what to talk about. So the book I'm writing right now is called Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. Already told you about it, but again, I'll tell you the main theme. Markets do the good things that sound bad. Things like saying, yeah, like we're not going to go and give you $1 million of healthcare just because it has a 1 in a million chance of saving your life. Too bad. Sorry. All right. Markets do the good things that sound bad. Governments do the bad things that sound good. Like saying, oh my God, that horrible greedy jerk. Let's give you all the taxpayer money you need for every treatment, no matter how expensive it is and no matter how unlikely it is to work.
Yeah.
Then next to my queue, there's a book called Poverty, Who to Blame. This is one that I've been talking about for some years, but I rearranged my queue. But anyway, so that's about a quarter written. And when Unbeatable's done, then I'll probably come back to that one. Then I've got another book next to my queue after that. This book is called Pragmatic Pacifism. This morning I talked about pacifism. So I know this is a view that people think of as totally unrealistic and naive. And this is a book where I say, look, if we think about it in a very certain way, narrow it down a bit, don't make the most extreme version, then actually it is a shockingly reasonable view. Namely, we just build with, first of all, in war, even the good guys do terrible things to innocent people. They really do, because it's just too hard to fight a war without going and murdering innocent people. Right? So it's like, sounds pretty bad, but maybe it's unavoidable. Saying, well, maybe, but here's the thing. Like you may say, well, we're killing these people, but it's all for the greater good. Everything's going to work out. Like, but will it though? Do we know it's going to work out? What is the actual track record of people who say wars are going to work out great? Right. And I say, yeah, actually, we got a lot of evidence that there's high uncertainty here. People who promise that everything's going to be great have very low reliability, which means that we should be much more cautious in listening to them and be much more skeptical about the actual propriety of fighting war.
Thank you very much, Bryan.
All right.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. Great job. Thank you. And by the way, Juan, so thank you for everything you're doing. When I look at your numbers on social media, like, Madre de Dios, lo creo.
Well, we have to keep fighting, yes. At least in Spain and in Spanish world to push liberty a little bit more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Y a todos vosotros.
Hasta la vista. Vaya con Dios. Todos.
A todos vosotros, a la audiencia, muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta hora de entrevista, la verdad muy interesante y con muchos puntos y matices que nos ha ofrecido Bryan Caplan, invitado estrella en la Universidad de las Hespérides, en los cursos de la Universidad de las Hespérides que hoy justamente terminan. Recordad que además la Universidad de las Hespérides también está ahora mismo ofreciendo sus cursos de grado y de posgrado que empiezan en el próximo mes de septiembre. Así que si queréis informaros sobre estos cursos dentro de esta universidad que reflexiona sobre las ideas de la libertad dentro de sus programas de grado y de posgrado, pues podéis obtener más información en el enlace que aparece en la caja de descripción del vídeo. Muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos en un próximo directo ya fuera de los cursos de verano de la universidad en el canal. Hasta luego.